Okay, great. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, George. Yeah, so I'm going to continue this discussion, updating folks about progress on the ceramic handbook. And my talk will be divided into two parts. First, I will continue our exploration of problematic ceramic groups by discussing Havanoid, Middle Woodland ceramics in mainly southeastern Minnesota. And then I'll transition into a second part where I will provide a summary of a survey that we distributed to hopefully a lot of you attending here participated in it, just probing practitioners into feedback on the 1979 ceramic handbook and hopes for the future handbook, the revised version. So the first part, we'll talk about Havanoid, and I'll start with just kind of a definition for those who aren't familiar, and if there's any members of the non-archaeology public attending. By Havanoid, I'm referring to ceramics that have influences or are inspired by Havana Hopewell ceramic traditions focused in the Illinois Valley to the south from about 200 BCE to 200 CE. Havana and Hopewell are pretty well known, especially for large earthworks, a distinctive art style, and complex networks of long-distance trade relations. In Minnesota, the Havana influence is seen most directly in the ceramic artifacts. The distribution of Havanoid ceramics in Minnesota is really focused in the southeast, and you saw in some of the slides from George that there's certainly Havana influences in Malmo and also in Laurel, but it appears to be most strongly represented in the southeast from the Anoka Sand Plain down along the Mississippi Trench, and then towards south central Minnesota. The collections, although there's small ceramic collections distributed across southern Minnesota that do have Havanoid representation, the biggest collections are from sites up on the Anoka Sand Plain, the Rice Creek chain of lakes area, the Spring Lake and Red Wing area, Lake Pepin area of the Mississippi Valley, and also out in central Minnesota in the Stearns and Candy Ojai, Meeker County area. So we propose a 4-phase sequence for southeastern Minnesota from the initial or early woodland, the initial arrival of ceramic artifacts through the Havana influence and then into the late middle woodland post-Havana world. Between 500 at the earliest, probably more like 300 BCE, and continuing into about 400 or so CE. So starting with the early woodland, ceramic technology in southeastern Minnesota begins probably around 300, maybe earlier BCE, with influences out of the downstream Mississippi Valley and the Illinois Valley, and these influences continue through the Havana horizon. The LaMoille phase, from about 500 to 200, is best represented by LaMoille thick ceramics. These bear similarities to Marion thick ceramics out of southwestern Wisconsin, Illinois, eastern Iowa, and they do demonstrate these earlier downstream connections in regard to ceramic technology. LaMoille ceramics are pretty well defined, and they have been for decades. They're extremely thick. They often have cord-marked interiors, occasionally have flat bases, like you see the base in the lower left. That's a sherd from Anoka County. They're decorated with punctates or fingernail impressions, and bosses are rare or even absent. So moving into the early middle woodland, we've proposed a phase called the River Lake phase, 200 to 0 BCE. This is a transition period and a phase where we see initial Havana influences. One of the types for this phase is Ordway cord marked. It's a continuation of cord marked wares that began in the early woodland and persist into the late pre-contact period. Ordway cord marked is thick. It's here where bosses are introduced. We have deeply cord marked roughened exteriors that are vertical or oblique. And the interiors are roughened, or even that interior cord impressing may have continued. Another ceramic group for the River Lake phase is Ordway stamped. This demonstrates the initial influences of Havana designs. We have bands of dentate stamping, or bands and fields of cord-wrapped stick stamping, as in the lower right example, applied faintly to still very thick vessels with coarse temper. It's at this time that we also see the application of the lip band design that is fairly ubiquitous across Havanoid vessels. The distribution of Ordway stamped is largely focused to the Mississippi Valley, especially the Spring Lake and Red Wing areas. Now, this type, sand and lunate stamped, is extremely provisional because we thought there was only one vessel where it was represented. The Sandon vessel on the left has been radiocarbon dated to 160 to 110 BCE, and it does display clear Havana influences with its banded design and lunate stamping. We thought it was a one-off until Dale Mull brought to our attention a second very similar vessel from Rice County that's on display at the Rice County Historical Society. And the Sandon vessel has a brushed or combed upper rim, and we do have other thick rim sherds with combed or brushed exterior in the Schilling site collection from the Spring Lake area. Okay, so into the center of Middle Woodland Havanoid. Traditionally, there's been two Havanoid phases for southeast Minnesota, the Sorg phase and the Howard Lake phase. The Sorg phase has had two types, ceramic types defined for it, Sorg banded and Sorg zoned. The Howard Lake phase, however, hasn't had any types associated with it. Instead, we've loosely employed Illinois Havana types. And we propose to combine those two into one single Howard Lake phase, keeping the Sorg types and then introducing several other Havanoid types. After examining the collections from across southern Minnesota, it's been clear, and George pointed this out in his talk too, that the diversity in design and design application is extreme among Middle Woodland Havanoid vessels. All groups and attributes applied to these vessels are applied in a wide variety of combinations, and they're present across the main distribution of Havanoid ceramics in southern Minnesota. Still, some patterns are clear when we group them. One being, in terms of form, Howard Lake vessels continue the bag-shaped form, which you can see in these vessels on the screen now. This bag-shaped form that really began in the early woodland. And we seem to lack the varied forms of vessels that are present in the Havana core to the south. So I'll start out with, I'm going to go through the 5 types that we've identified for the Howard Lake phase, beginning with Sorg banded, which was first defined by Eldon Johnson and then refined for the 1979 Handbook. And with Sorg banded, we have complex and varied designs in bands with incised boundaries, either single lines or often double incised lines with dentate stamping. Bosses are extremely common, or even plain areas filling the bands. Again, the lip band is ubiquitous. And the ceramic artists often used different tools or different techniques to fill within each band. We have both beveled lips and non-beveled lips, roughly about 50-50 in most collections, although the Anoka sand plane, like the Anderson site, tends to trend towards beveled lips, and then slightly less so in other areas. The other type that's been pretty well defined is sword zoned, and Scott Anfinson had defined this one. Here we have zones forming motifs or medallions that descend from the lip band or upper rim banding. And the zones are also defined by incised lines. A problem with this is that you need large sherds to be able to identify it as sword zoned. And if you just have small rim sherds, you'll probably recognize it as sword banded. With sword zoned, we also have a mixture of beveled and non-beveled lips. The drawing on the right shows rollouts of Havana vessels from Illinois with zoned designs and these medallion designs, and it's likely that the zone designs in Minnesota are in some ways similar. Note also along the right-hand side of this slide the variety in vessel forms that are seen in the Havana core in Illinois, and we don't have that in Minnesota. So now a couple new proposed types. This is Centerville pattern stamped. In this case, the stamping with the same tool is applied in multiple directions, oblique or horizontal or vertical lines are alternated to create a herringbone pattern. And incised lines and nodes are, incised lines are absent, nodes are extremely uncommon. And then Centerville incised, these sherds bear only incised lines. They lack stamping of almost any time, except occasionally some dowel impressions on the lip interior. Or in the center example from Hennepin County, we have either a wrapped rod or a notched rod impressing or stamping between the nodes. And this, of course, illustrates one of the challenges with Middle Woodland ceramic traditions. There seems to be an exception to every rule. And then with Centerville column stamped, we have columns of dentate or pseudo scallop shell stamping, as you see on the left, with plain spaces in between. The lip banding continues. There's no incising. The right-hand sherd is a little unique in that it is cord marked up to the lip and does have nodes. So moving into the late Middle Woodland, where we propose a gray cloud phase to represent the post-Havana world. And these ceramics are similar to the Linware in Wisconsin or Weaver in Illinois and Iowa. This is contemporaneous with Millville and Alameda phases in Wisconsin and Iowa. It's a continuation of the banded Havana-like designs applied to thinner walled vessels with finer temper. With shilling stamped, we have fine dentate and comb stamping. This is the norm with some cord wrap stick stamping. We also see the rise of chevrons and crosshatch design motifs. The shilling column stamp, sort of a continuation of the column stamping tradition. It's from our observations, it's less common, but it's column stamping on thinner walls with cord wrap stick, dentate, or rocker stamping. Okay, now I want to shift gears to the second part of my talk, where I want to give you all a summary of a survey that we distributed to solicit feedback on both the 1979 ceramic handbook and the hopes for the future. And the goal of the survey was to inform our recommendations for content and structure of the final project, which we'll be putting into our report for phase 1 of the ceramic handbook. So this part of the presentation, when I first put my slides together, it was all words, which I understand can be kind of deadly. And so to give you all something to look at, I've added cartoons and illustrations by Vern Anderson. So those of us who work at the Science Museum were saddened because Vern passed away last week. And he was a good friend and a great colleague. Vern Anderson was an artist, an illustrator, and a cartoonist, and a Science Museum volunteer for decades. So he's going to be deeply missed, and I hope you enjoy some of his art as I talk about the survey. So we distributed the survey. First of all, we worked with some of our colleagues in the Science Museum of Minnesota's Department of Evaluation and Research, and they specialize on surveys, and they produce surveys to solicit feedback on our exhibits and other products. And it seemed like a great opportunity to work with them to try and learn what you folks all hope for the new handbook, and things that should carry over from the 1979 volume. We received 43 responses. The sample, so the first part of the survey was to learn a little bit more about who was responding, and the demographics and the professional position of respondents. And then the second part was largely free response answers to various questions. As far as the identity of the respondents, the majority responding were white and male, probably a reflection of the field, I suspect. And then as far as the professional background of the respondents, most of you who responded are highly experienced field archaeologists. Most of you don't identify as ceramic specialists, but almost everybody who responded indicated that they are regular users of the 1979 edition. So in the open-ended responses, we really prompted folks to reflect on what is useful about the 1979 edition, what do you wish was different, and then we requested recommendations for the revised handbook, as I've said. And I will say almost everybody who used the handbook regularly responded with general accolades for the 79 volume, as well as an acknowledgement that after 40 years, it's time for it to be updated. Okay, so reflections on the 79 edition, things that people liked. And I will say that what I'm showing you now are, we were able to group the responses into various different categories. And so these responses are, most of them, if not all of them, are responses that lots of people said. In other words, a lot of people said the same things. Most of you really appreciate the illustrations in the 79 edition, as well as the distribution maps. You appreciate the glossary of terms, having a chapter that discusses ceramic technology, really helps with understanding ceramic artifacts. Lists of key sites and collections within each ceramic grouping, a consistent layout, so it's easy to find things. It's the sort of a volume that you flip through quite a bit. And then it was indicated that it should be clearly written, as all of our work should be. And it was appreciated by multiple people that there is an acknowledgement of the limitations of the ceramic handbook.
And this is Bruce. You got like 2 or 3 minutes left.
I have 2 slides. I'll be done in a second.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks.
So as far as suggestions for the revised edition, I've grouped them into suggestions for format and for content, and then there's a couple other suggestions. So just to run through these really quickly, the suggestions for format included keeping it highly visual, include photographs instead, in addition to the illustrations, and have more of a range, represent more of a range of variation within each ceramic grouping. And then it should be reorganized chronologically or geographically. The current 1979 issue is alphabetical. And then it was suggested by several to have it set spiral bound and water resistant lab manual style. For new information, there's general agreement that it should be updated, of course. Also having reference to cognate types and imports from other states. A lot of folks said that we should have a flow chart or some sort of a how-to on identifying your ceramics. George and I joke that it's so you found a sherd. chapter. So really, how to work with small collections or small sherds. Have a radiocarbon roundup and an index. And then other suggestions include there should be consistency, of course, in terminology. We should maintain clear and accessible writing, right for professionals and the public. Go beyond types classification to include chapters about use, artistry, interaction, multiple perspectives. I think along the lines of Mike McClovick's talk earlier today. And then the handbook should be scheduled to be updated probably on a decadal level. So that is it for me, and thank you.
Cool.